A knock at the door on a bright Florida morning. Standing on the porch is a clown, neon orange wig, a wide painted smile, a red bulbous nose. In one hand, a bouquet of carnations. In the other, 2 foil balloons. One bears a cheerful message praising the recipient. The homeowner remarks how pretty the flowers are and reaches out. The clown raises a gun and fires a bullet directly into her face. The balloons drift upward as the painted killer walks calmly back to a getaway car. This wasn't a child's nightmare. It was a cold-blooded execution. Please support the channel by subscribing and liking this video. Thank you so much. Wellington, Florida, in the late 1980s, was a sanctuary built for the affluent. Situated deep in Palm Beach County, it was an enclave defined by manicured equestrian estates, private airstrips, and heavy bank accounts. The humid air smelled of freshly laid asphalt and cut Bermuda grass. It was the kind of place where wrought iron gates kept the outside world at bay, creating an illusion of absolute security. In the exclusive Aero Club neighborhood, where wide driveways doubled as taxiways for personal aircraft, lived 40-year-old Marlene Warren. Her life appeared to be a flawless reflection of the American dream. She resided in a sprawling multi-level home encompassing over 4,000 square feet, situated on a lush 2-acre lot. But the pristine, sun-drenched facade of her property concealed the heavy toll of a fractured marriage. Marlene was not a product of generational wealth, nor did she adopt the pretentious airs of her neighbors. She was an inherently grounded woman who preferred the quiet satisfaction of landscaping in the oppressive 90-degree Florida heat over attending high society galas. Friends remembered her as generous and fiercely protective of her 2 teenage sons from a previous marriage, John and Joseph. Despite the vast expanse of marble and imported fixtures surrounding her, she maintained a simple, pragmatic approach to her daily routine. She was the anchor of her family, a steady, warm presence who constantly balanced the relentless, sharp-edged ambition of her husband, Michael. Michael Warren was a man driven by the mechanics of leverage and profit. He operated a highly lucrative used car dealership named Bargain Motors, located miles away in West Palm Beach. It was a high-volume enterprise that generated massive amounts of liquid cash and served as the cornerstone of their expanding empire. Together, they had accumulated an impressive portfolio over their 18-year marriage. They controlled a fleet of vehicles, a collection of residential rental properties scattered across the county, and a private airplane parked just hundreds of feet from their back door. Yet, the financial architecture of their wealth was uniquely structured. The vast majority of these high-value assets, including the dealership, the real estate, and the properties, were legally held in Marlene's name. This detail was initially pitched as a savvy strategic move to protect the businesses from corporate liabilities. But as the years wore on and the affection drained from their union, that legal distinction evolved into an invisible, suffocating chain binding a deteriorating relationship. By early 1990, the financial ledger was thriving, but the emotional foundation of the Warren household was rapidly decaying. Marlene began to confide in her mother that she felt entirely trapped. The warmth of their early years had evaporated, replaced by cold indifference and sharp, sudden arguments over operational control and money. Michael spent increasingly long, unexplained hours at the West Palm Beach dealership, distancing himself from the estate in Wellington. He was a man heavily accustomed to getting exactly what he wanted, and he was acutely aware that his wife held the legal keys to everything he had spent nearly 2 decades building. Divorce seemed like the logical exit strategy, but the deep financial entanglement made a clean, bloodless break completely impossible. If they separated, Michael stood to lose the car lot, the rental properties, and his elevated social standing. He would be stripped of the very capital that defined his entire identity. The tension inside the Aero Club home grew thick and palpable. Marlene began to sense a distinct shift in her environment, a subtle, creeping dread that she could not easily dismiss. She began keeping closer track of the business ledgers. During hushed phone calls, she mentioned to close friends that if anything unnatural or violent ever happened to her, they needed to look very closely at her husband. She possessed no hard evidence of a physical threat, just the undeniable primal instinct of a woman who recognized that the man sitting across the dinner table now viewed her not as a life partner, but as a major financial obstacle. Bargain Motors occupied a blistering stretch of commercial real estate in West Palm Beach, defined by rows of polished sedans baking under the intense Florida sun and the constant, abrasive hustle of commissioned salesmen. It was an environment fueled by high-interest loans and desperate buyers. Michael Warren thrived in this ecosystem. He possessed the sharp, predatory instincts required to move inventory and secure financing for customers who lived paycheck to paycheck. But dealing in subprime auto loans inherently meant dealing with defaults. When payments abruptly stopped, Michael needed a reliable mechanism to retrieve his assets. He required someone willing to navigate poorly lit apartment complexes and hostile driveways in the dead of night to reclaim vehicles. Enter Sheila Keen. At 27 years old, Sheila possessed a hardened, abrasive edge that perfectly suited the automotive repossession industry. She was striking, with thick blonde hair and a commanding physical presence, but her appearance was secondary to her sheer operational ruthlessness. Working as a repo agent demanded a specific type of grit. She routinely arrived at default addresses at 3 in the morning, armed with duplicate keys and a quiet tow truck, sliding behind the wheel of a repossessed car before the owner even realized the engine had started. She was fearless, aggressive, and entirely unsentimental about the work. Michael recognized a mirrored reflection of his own ambition in her. They shared a blunt, transactional view of the world, a philosophy where morality was secondary to securing the asset. The professional boundary between the dealership owner and his top recovery agent collapsed with remarkable speed. Late-night vehicle repossessions seamlessly bled into late-night drinks at local dive bars, which eventually evolved into locked-door meetings inside Michael's executive office. The atmosphere on the asphalt lot began to shift. Employees at Bargain Motors were observant. They tracked the sudden, unexplained absences in the middle of the workday. They noticed the prolonged lunches and the undeniable heavy tension whenever the two shared a confined space. Sheila's status rapidly elevated from an independent contractor to an untouchable figure within the company hierarchy. She began dictating terms, acting less like hired muscle and more like a senior partner holding equity in the operation. Michael, usually a man of meticulous calculation, allowed his arrogance to override his caution. He began aggressively siphoning capital from the dealership's operational accounts to finance a shadow life. The financial drain was substantial. He signed a lease on an apartment for Sheila in a discreet residential complex miles away from his expansive equestrian estate in Wellington. He systematically covered her personal expenses, purchasing high-end clothing and paying her utility bills. He was essentially running a parallel household, funding his mistress using the liquid cash generated by an enterprise legally owned by his wife. Back in the 4,000-square-foot home in the Aero Club neighborhood, Marlene was actively reviewing the corporate ledgers. As the legal owner of the entire portfolio, the numbers were her domain. She possessed a sharp, analytical mind and quickly detected the bleeding revenue. The anomalies in the accounting were impossible to ignore. Missing cash bundles, fabricated expense reports, and withdrawals that possessed no corresponding invoices. Furthermore, the automotive community in Palm Beach County was insular. The whispers originating from the sales floor of Bargain Motors drifted across the county lines, eventually reaching Marlene's ears. The abstract sense of dread she had been harboring suddenly materialized into a concrete, devastating reality. It was not merely a physical betrayal, it was a sustained, aggressive financial theft. The ensuing confrontations inside the Wellington estate were visceral and uncompromising. Marlene cornered her husband, demanding accountability for the missing funds and the blonde repo agent living on his secret payroll. Michael responded with flat, aggressive dismissals. He attempted to dismantle her reality, loudly insisting she was paranoid and fundamentally misinterpreting standard business expenditures. He utilized his commanding physical presence to intimidate her into silence, but Marlene refused to break. Instead, she drew a hard, unforgiving line. During a particularly vicious argument, she explicitly leveraged the one vulnerability Michael possessed. She reminded him that her name rested on every single deed, every corporate license, and every bank account. She made it unequivocally clear that if he continued to humiliate her and drain their resources, she would legally dismantle the empire. She threatened to dissolve the marriage, seize the dealership, liquidate the rental properties, and leave him with absolutely nothing. That specific threat fundamentally altered the trajectory of their conflict. Michael found himself cornered by his own legal machinations. A divorce would be financially catastrophic, instantly reducing him from an affluent kingpin to a middle management employee stripped of his inventory. Sheila, too, had grown deeply accustomed to the continuous influx of cash and the elevated lifestyle. Returning to the grueling, dangerous existence of a street-level repo agent was no longer an option she was willing to entertain. By the spring of 1990, the loud, explosive arguments inside the Warren household ceased, replaced by a suffocating, lethal silence. Marlene confided in her parents that the situation had escalated beyond infidelity. She told them, with chilling clarity, that she genuinely believed her husband and his new associate were capable of profound violence. The tactical standoff had reached a breaking point. Michael was no longer calculating the cost of a divorce attorney. He was evaluating the precise, bloody mechanics of an assassination. Saturday, May the 26th, 1990, began with the heavy, suffocating humidity typical of South Florida. By mid-morning, the temperature was already pushing past 80 degrees Fahrenheit. It was Memorial Day weekend, a time usually reserved for neighborhood barbecues and the low drone of small private aircraft taxiing down the Aero Club runways. Inside the 4,000-square-foot estate, the central air conditioning hummed, sealing the occupants away from the oppressive heat. The residence projected an atmosphere of total, unshakable security. The master of the house was entirely absent. Michael had departed the property hours earlier, informing his family that he was driving south to a racetrack in the Miami area. The journey would place him roughly 70 miles away from Wellington. This was a highly convenient geographic buffer. He had specifically chosen a destination crowded with spectators, an environment where he would be highly visible to dozens of potential witnesses. The sprawling house was left to his wife and her 22-year-old son from a previous marriage, Joseph Aarons. In the expansive dining area, a late breakfast was underway. Joseph and a few of his friends sat around the table, casually discussing their plans for the long weekend. The matriarch of the house moved between the kitchen and the living spaces, navigating the morning with her usual grounded efficiency. The tension that normally choked the household was temporarily lifted by her husband's absence. The environment was domestic, relaxed, and utterly mundane. At approximately 10:45 a.m., the rhythmic crunch of tires against the long pavement of the driveway signaled an arrival. A white Chrysler LeBaron convertible, top raised, rolled onto the property. The vehicle moved at a steady, deliberate pace, completely ignoring the unspoken rule that strangers did not simply wander into the gated luxury of the Aero Club. The car came to a halt near the front entryway. The driver shifted into park, but left the engine idling. The heavy driver's side door swung open, and a figure stepped out onto the hot concrete. The intruder did not fit the aesthetic of the manicured equestrian community. It was a clown. The visual details were stark and jarring against the lush green landscaping. The figure wore a synthetic, electric orange wig that sat unnaturally on the head. The face was entirely obscured by thick, opaque white grease paint, applied heavily to mask any recognizable human features. A large, bulbous red sponge nose was affixed to the center of the face. Below it, a grotesque red smile had been painted on, stretching aggressively past the natural lip line. The clown was dressed in a baggy, multicolored costume, concealing the physical build and gender of the person underneath. In one gloved hand, the painted intruder held a vibrant floral arrangement consisting of red and white carnations. In the other hand, a ribbon tethered 2 mylar foil balloons. One balloon featured an illustration of Snow White. The second was silver, stamped with an upbeat, generic phrase declaring the recipient to be the greatest. The clown closed the car door and began walking toward the main entrance. The stride was not the exaggerated, clumsy walk of a performer. It was measured, purposeful, lethal. Inside the dining room, the sound of the approaching footsteps was masked by the ambient noise of breakfast conversation. The clown reached the massive wooden double doors. There was no hesitation. A heavy, firm knock echoed through the foyer. The homeowner stepped away from the kitchen area, navigating the tiled floors toward the entryway. Joseph remained seated at the table, roughly 20 feet away. He had a clear, unobstructed line of sight down the hallway to the front door. He watched his mother reach for the brass handle. She pulled the heavy door inward. The dense, humid Florida air immediately rushed into the foyer, bringing with it the bizarre, brightly colored specter waiting on the threshold. The homeowner stood face to face with the intruder. There was no theatrical performance, no joyful greeting, no laughter. The clown remained entirely silent, standing rigid in the doorway. The only audible sound was the crinkling of the mylar balloons shifting in the warm morning breeze. A wave of confusion washed over the foyer. Assuming this was a quirky telegram delivery or a bizarre promotional stunt, she offered a polite observation. She looked down at the carnations and remarked on how pretty the flowers were. She lifted her hands, reaching out to accept the arrangement. The clown did not hand over the flowers. Instead, the figure smoothly raised its opposite hand. Concealed within the grip was a .38 caliber revolver. The barrel was leveled with cold precision directly at the homeowner's face. The transition from a confusing suburban interaction to absolute terminal violence took less than a fraction of a second. A single crack, deafening. The concussive blast shattered the quiet Saturday morning. The sharp smell of sulfur and burnt gunpowder instantly choked the enclosed hallway. The bullet struck with devastating accuracy, impacting the victim directly in the face. The physical force dropped her instantly. She collapsed backward onto the hard tile floor, her body going entirely limp. The foil balloon slipped from the killer's grasp, drifting upward to scrape quietly against the high ceiling. The bouquet of carnations tumbled to the floor, scattering bright red and white petals across the pooling blood. Inside the house, reality fractured. Joseph shoved the heavy breakfast table aside, the legs screeching against the floor, and sprinted toward the foyer. Outside, the shooter exhibited a chilling, psychopathic lack of urgency. The clown did not run. There was no frantic scramble to escape the scene of a broad daylight execution. The figure simply turned around and walked back to the idling Chrysler LeBaron with an unhurried, methodical stride. Joseph reached the entryway, his eyes briefly registering the catastrophic trauma inflicted on his mother before locking onto the retreating figure. He bolted out the front door. His bare feet slapped violently against the scorching pavement. He screamed at the driver, his voice tearing through the quiet neighborhood, demanding the vehicle stop. He closed the distance rapidly, getting within a few yards of the rear bumper. He immediately logged critical tactical details: the white paint, the tinted windows, and the distinct absence of a front license plate. The clown slid into the driver's seat and pulled the door shut. The engine flared. With the same mechanical calmness exhibited on the porch, the killer shifted the transmission into gear. The tires gripped the asphalt, and the LeBaron accelerated smoothly down the street. It did not peel out. It did not fishtail. It simply drove away, merging into the labyrinth of Wellington's exclusive avenues, disappearing like a ghost in broad daylight. Joseph turned and rushed back into the house. The scene in the foyer was a waking nightmare. His mother lay motionless on the tiles, bleeding heavily and gasping for air. He grabbed the phone. The emergency dispatcher on the other end of the 911 call was met with the raw, unfiltered terror of a son frantically begging for an ambulance, trying to articulate the impossible reality that a clown had just arrived at their home and pulled a trigger. Paramedics arrived within minutes, their sirens cutting through the affluent silence of the Aero Club. They breached the front doors, forced to step over the discarded carnations and the brightly colored costume props to reach the victim. The medical personnel worked frantically to stabilize her compromised airway. She was loaded into the back of an ambulance and rushed to a local trauma center. She was placed on advanced life support, her body fighting a desperate, losing battle against severe, irreversible neurological damage. 2 days later, the medical machinery was unhooked. The execution was officially complete. The immediate aftermath of the shooting triggered a surreal tactical response. Dispatchers broadcasted a county-wide BOLO, be on the lookout. Law enforcement officers stationed along the major arteries of Palm Beach County were suddenly tasked with hunting down a suspect matching an impossible description. They scanned passing traffic for an electric orange wig, a red sponge nose, and a painted smile. The sheer absurdity of the profile hindered the initial dragnet. A clown driving a white Chrysler LeBaron convertible down the Florida Turnpike should have been a blindingly obvious target. Yet, The vehicle had vanished. The driver had seamlessly melted into the heavy Memorial Day weekend traffic, exploiting the holiday congestion and the maze of suburban roads branching off the main highways. Within hours, the psychological fallout hit Wellington like a physical shockwave. The Aero Club was a fortress of privilege, a place where violent crime was an abstract concept meant for the evening news, not the manicured driveways of multi-million-dollar estates. When word spread that a resident had been executed on her own doorstep by an assassin disguised as a joyful messenger, the illusion of safety collapsed. Panic infected the affluent grid. Security protocols were overhauled overnight. Iron gates were deadbolted. Homeowners refused to open their doors for unexpected couriers. Delivery drivers bearing floral arrangements or standard mail were met with intense suspicion, often greeted by residents holding firearms behind frosted glass. The universal symbol of childhood amusement had been effectively weaponized, leaving a toxic dread over the entire community. The innocence of a suburban weekend was replaced by a paranoid lockdown. Detectives from the Palm Beach County Sheriff's Office immediately initiated a multi-tiered search. The physical evidence left at the threshold, the tethered mylar balloons and the scattered red and white carnations, provided the first tangible breadcrumbs. Investigators needed to reverse engineer the assassin's logistics. A killer meticulously dressed in full theatrical garb did not just materialize out of thin air. Every item was a commercial product. The props had to be acquired locally. The search grid for the getaway vehicle yielded the first major break exactly 4 days later. A patrol unit located the white Chrysler LeBaron abandoned in a crowded parking lot at a strip mall in Royal Palm Beach, just a few miles from the crime scene. The car had been reported stolen from a local rental agency a month prior. The tactical recovery team processed the vehicle with surgical precision. The exterior was wiped completely clean of usable prints, demonstrating the perpetrator's forensic awareness. But the interior held critical microscopic clues. Vacuuming the upholstery and the driver's side floorboards revealed distinct synthetic orange fibers, a direct, undeniable match to the neon wig described by the victim's son. Furthermore, crime scene technicians extracted a few strands of long, brown human hair resting on the seats. The car was the definitive link, proving the assassin had used a stolen rental as a disposable burner vehicle to navigate the affluent neighborhood undetected. Simultaneously, a massive canvassing operation targeted every party supply store, florist, and costume shop within a 50-mile radius. Detectives flashed photographs of the distinct foil balloons. The breakthrough occurred at a public supermarket in West Palm Beach. Employees distinctly recalled a woman purchasing those exact items less than 2 hours before the execution. The clerks described the buyer as a striking female with long brown hair. They noted her demeanor as intensely focused, impatient. She had paid entirely in cash. The floral arrangement was subsequently tracked to a nearby commercial florist. The shop owner confirmed a recent cash transaction for a specific bouquet of red and white carnations. The physical description of the buyer aligned perfectly with the report generated from the supermarket. A tall, commanding woman with brown hair who moved with a rigid sense of urgency. The net tightened even further when investigators zeroed in on the theatrical components. A specialty costume shop situated within the county limits provided the most damning logistical evidence. 2 days prior to the shooting, a woman matching the exact same physical profile had walked through the front doors. She marched to the counter and requested a highly specific inventory: a clown suit, a bright orange wig, and a complete theatrical grease paint kit. The clerk recalled the transaction vividly. The customer had insisted on paying with a large wad of cash, and she seemed entirely uninterested in the fit or the style of the costume. She was strictly focused on acquiring the visual disguise as quickly as possible. The paper trail was practically non-existent, deliberately severed by the exclusive use of cash. However, the consistent eyewitness accounts formed a rigid, undeniable profile. The assassin was not a random, chaotic drifter. It was a highly orchestrated, premeditated hit. The killer had spent days systematically gathering the necessary components, building a psychological Trojan horse that would ensure the target opened her heavy front door without a shred of hesitation. Detectives began cross-referencing the physical description of the meticulous buyer with the victim's immediate circle. They were hunting for a tall woman with brown hair, someone with unrestricted access to large reserves of cash, and someone possessing the cold, calculated nerve to walk up to a porch in broad daylight and pull a trigger. The investigative focus rapidly shifted away from the perimeter of Wellington. The authorities turned their attention sharply toward the West Palm Beach car lot, the unaccounted corporate funds, and the aggressive repossession agent who had firmly embedded herself into the widower's shadow life. The frantic hunt for a painted clown seamlessly transitioned into the hunt for a woman who spent her nights stealing back defaulted cars. Detectives converged on the widower with absolute tactical focus. He was brought into the interrogation room, projecting the somber, quiet aura of a grieving husband, but the performance rang hollow to seasoned investigators. When pressed on his exact coordinates during the execution, he immediately deployed a watertight, heavily documented alibi. He provided toll booth receipts, gas station timestamps, and multiple eyewitness accounts, placing him at a busy Miami racetrack. He was undeniably 70 miles south of the Aero Club estate when the bullet was fired. He had insulated himself with unshakable geographic distance. The authorities knew he had not pulled the trigger. He was the architect, not the mechanic. The crosshairs snapped directly onto the aggressive repossession agent. She was pulled into the precinct and seated across from homicide detectives. She projected a hardened, abrasive defiance, completely immune to standard interrogation pressures. She issued flat, monotone denials to every inquiry. She claimed she spent the entire Saturday morning executing routine vehicle repossessions. When confronted with the eyewitness descriptions from the supermarket and the costume shop, her expression remained entirely blank. A search warrant was swiftly executed at her apartment. The clandestine residence heavily funded by the West Palm Beach dealership. Investigators dismantled the interior, hunting for the .38 caliber revolver, the grease paint, or the baggy clown suit. The physical sweep yielded absolutely nothing of substance. The assassin had meticulously sanitized her environment. The absence of a smoking gun forced the investigation into a chaotic lateral drift. The defense strategy deliberately muddied the waters, forcing the police to examine the massive list of enemies the used car magnate had cultivated. Bargain Motors was a breeding ground for raw hostility. Detectives were obligated to interview dozens of furious, financially ruined individuals whose vehicles had been snatched in the dead of night. Could a disgruntled, heavily indebted customer have disguised themselves to exact maximum psychological and physical revenge on the family? Investigators burned hundreds of man-hours chasing these phantom leads down blind alleys. They pulled repossession logs, cross-referencing angry buyers with violent criminal records. Every lead systematically fizzled out. The hostile customers possessed obvious motives, but absolutely none of them held the synchronized insider knowledge of the household's weekend schedule, nor the financial backing to orchestrate a clean, untraceable hit. These red herrings drained crucial momentum from the primary suspect. The core of the investigative paralysis lay in the era itself. The crime scene technicians possessed the physical strands of brown hair and the synthetic orange wig fibers extracted from the abandoned Chrysler LeBaron. In a modern context, that biological material would secure an indictment within weeks. But forensic science at the dawn of the 1990s was agonizingly primitive. DNA profiling was in its absolute infancy, restricted to massive, pristine biological samples that simply did not exist in this case. The laboratory could only perform subjective, microscopic hair comparisons. An analyst could state the strands were visually consistent with the suspect's hair, but it lacked the rigid statistical certainty required for a capital murder trial. Without a taped confession, the murder weapon, or undeniable biological proof, the circumstantial timeline of costume purchases and an ongoing illicit affair was deemed to be legally insufficient. The state attorney's office reviewed the dense binders of evidence and refused to file charges. The threshold for reasonable doubt was simply too high. The momentum died. The investigation hit a solid concrete wall. The case file was shoved into a steel cabinet in the records division, relegated to the cold case archives. Years dissolved into decades. The physical evidence, the hairs, the neon fibers, the ribbon from the mylar balloons, sat frozen in a climate-controlled vault. Meanwhile, The primary targets seamlessly integrated their lives. Michael formally severed his remaining legal ties to his deceased wife's estate, absorbing the liquidated assets. 12 years after the execution, he and his former repo agent legally married. They abandoned the heavy humidity of Palm Beach County, relocating to the quiet, mountainous terrain of Abingdon, Virginia. They purchased a sprawling, expensive home and opened a popular, family-friendly burger restaurant. They lived a highly comfortable, upper-middle-class existence. They attended community events and managed a thriving business, functioning exactly like ordinary, successful entrepreneurs. They operated under the assumption that the bloody morning in Florida had been permanently erased from history. 24 years passed in absolute silence. Then, the Palm Beach County Sheriff's Office Cold Case Unit systematically pulled the dusty files back onto an active desk. Technology had finally evolved to catch up with the preserved evidence. The microscopic strands retrieved from the driver's seat of the stolen getaway car were submitted to an advanced forensic laboratory. Mitochondrial analysis and short tandem repeat profiling, methodologies that sounded like pure science fiction in 1990, were aggressively applied to the degraded biological samples. The laboratory technicians successfully extracted a viable, complete genetic sequence. They compared it against a known sample. The results returned with mathematical, absolute certainty. The biological material abandoned inside the Chrysler LeBaron belonged exclusively to Sheila. The logistical puzzle from the Memorial Day weekend was finally locked into place by incontrovertible, microscopic science. The 27-year waiting game was over. The ghost in the orange wig finally had a verifiable name. In September 2017, a heavily armed tactical team surrounded a quiet, upscale residence in Abingdon, Virginia. The 54-year-old restaurant owner was placed in handcuffs, finally confronted with the ghosts of Palm Beach County. She was extradited back to Florida to face first-degree murder charges, but the wheels of justice ground at an agonizing pace. Pre-trial motions, fierce defense maneuvers attacking the decades-old forensic methodologies, and a global pandemic delayed the proceedings for another 6 years. The prosecution possessed the DNA, but key witnesses had died, and memories had severely faded. Facing a grueling trial and the very real possibility of a compromised jury, the state offered a compromise. In April 2023, 33 years after the execution, a plea deal was struck. The former repo agent pleaded guilty to second-degree murder while simultaneously maintaining her innocence. It was a legal paradox designed strictly to secure a reduced sentence. The judge handed down a 12-year term. However, after calculating the time already served awaiting trial and applying standard statutory credits, she walked out of a Florida prison mere months later. It was a deeply flawed, hollow conclusion to an orchestrated assassination. A universal symbol of joy, weaponized into a vessel of terror. Marlene Warren expected a simple gesture of kindness, only to face a cold execution masked in bright grease paint. The justice system finally named her killer, yet the brevity of the sentence feels like a grotesque punchline. 33 years of stolen life, traded for mere months behind bars. The synthetic orange wig now degrades in an evidence vault, but the psychological scar left on that Florida community is permanent. They learned a brutal truth. The most ruthless predators do not lurk in the shadows. They walk right up to your front porch, hiding behind a painted smile. Please like this video and share your thoughts about this case in the comments. Be sure to check out our previous videos as well. See you soon.